Tonight's topic, philosophy of mind and theism, cognitive science and immaterial minds. Theism is the position that an immensely powerful immaterial mind created and governs the universe. But what is an immaterial mind? In this talk, James Fodor will consider this question in the light of cognitive science, considering the various aspects and functions that make up a mind. James will argue that it is very difficult to reconcile most of what is currently known about minds with the idea that they can exist without a material substrate, especially when combined with the various traits that theists claim of the divine mind. James will therefore suggest that the notion of an all-powerful and all-knowing immaterial mind may be conceptually incoherent. A little bit about James. James Fodor is a PhD student in cognitive neuroscience at the University of Melbourne. His research focuses on analyzing computational models of how complex semantic concepts are represented in the brain. Outside of research, James has a keen interest in science, philosophy, and critical thinking. James hosts a YouTube channel where he discusses philosophy of religion and is the author of the book Unreasonable Faith. He is passionate about effective altruism, including causes such as global poverty and animal welfare. Please join me in welcoming James, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. Over to you, James.
Cool. Thanks very much for having me along, and thanks everyone for coming. Let me just share my slides here. All right, so Akiva already introduced the topic that I'm going to be talking about today. So let me just give a introduction of what I'm going to be arguing and kind of why I'm talking about this or what the connection is. So as Akiva said, I'm a cognitive science researcher, cognitive neuroscientist. So I'm interested in brains and minds and how we think and reason and how all that's implemented in the brain. I'm also interested in philosophy of religion, theism, and arguments for and against the existence of God, the effects of religion on society, and so forth. And something I've been thinking about kind of more recently is the intersection of these two interests or these two areas. And it's something that hasn't really received very much attention in, at least as far as I know, in like philosophy of religion. So God is conceived of as an immaterial mind or something very much like a mind, as I'll discuss in a moment. But what's interesting to me about that is that often the way that theists talk about God or talk about an immaterial mind is just purely on the basis of our pre-theoretic intuitions about what a mind is. Because, like, well, we all have minds, right? So we must know about them, presumably. Well, what I'm going to be arguing is that actually we do know quite a lot about minds from not just from sort of pre-theoretic intuitions, but from cognitive science. And what we do know about them really casts a lot of doubt on the idea that a mind can be immaterial. So that's the sort of basic idea of what I'm going to be talking about this evening. So I also want to apologize at the outset. In putting these slides together, I realized that some of the material is a little more technical than I might have initially hoped. So that's one of the reasons why I suggested you can to hold questions to the end or potentially put things in chat, because not I'll go through a number of details on various points. It's not necessary to understand every detail of every slide that I introduce. Usually I'm introducing things to give you a bit of a background in something or to illustrate a particular point. And so hopefully it will be clear sort of what's critical and what isn't. And if people have questions, as I said, stick it in chat or we can talk about it afterwards. All right, so let's get going then. So as I've said here, God is supposed to be an immaterial mind. I'm not going to really talk specifically about theistic claims or like theological claims from any specific religion. I'm just going to talk about God more in the abstract. But most conceptions of God have that it is an immaterial mind. There are certain conceptions that allow God to be embodied. Of course, one of the most common probably is Jesus, right, which is supposed to be the incarnation of God. But certainly God qua God, like God as such, is not supposed to be embodied. So I would suggest ask Christians about how that's supposed to make sense. But in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on God as the idea of some sort of immaterial mind or spirit. So the essential argument that I'm making is follows. God is supposed to be some kind of immaterial mind, but minds almost certainly can't be immaterial, so God almost certainly does not exist. Um, and there'll be, while I'm focusing on God, this argument I think also applies to other types of immaterial minds that some people believe in or sometimes talk about, like souls, demons, nature spirits, or other things like this. I'm not exclusively talking about God, but that is an important aspect. And God is distinct from other minds in important ways. So God has additional attributes like omniscience and so forth. So I'll talk more about that in due course. But hopefully, at least that gives you an idea of where we're going here. So let me just move some of these notifications that are appearing so I can see my headings. Okay. Now here's an interesting question. What is a mind? This is actually something that I've almost never seen discussed. Almost no one bothers to define what a mind is, either in philosophy or in science. This definition here I just pulled from Wikipedia, which seemed to be as good a definition as any. So the mind is that which thinks, feels, perceives, imagines, remembers, and wills. Now, just thinking about this for a second, you might perhaps realize that there's an issue with this as a definition of a mind, because it doesn't actually say anything about what a mind is. It's just a list of things that minds do. Now, that's not necessarily a problem because a lot of things are defined functionally. That means in terms of what they do, not necessarily as what they are, sort of essentially. But it does raise questions because what if we have something that does some of these things but not others? Is it still a mind? Like, does it have to do all of these things? Are some more important than others? Are they connected to each other? Is this a comprehensive list? Probably not, but like these are some of the major ones. So even just sort of thinking about it a little bit more rigorously, we maybe realize that it's sort of unclear as to what the boundaries of like minds are and what is required for something to be a mind. And so one starting point we can have is, look, we know that humans have minds, or at least the vast majority of humans. Maybe you think that someone who's brain dead plausibly doesn't have a mind, but the vast majority of humans have minds, and at least some, maybe many animals have minds, perhaps simpler forms of minds. Maybe they don't have all of our cognitive capacities, but they at least have some. And so we can make a start on understanding what a mind is by studying human minds and animal minds, generally with a focus on human minds because it's easier to study those and at least plausibly, they're the most sophisticated minds that we know about. Now, I will be focusing this talk on human minds, but also wanting to not rule out the idea that there may be, or at some point in the future, may be artificial minds, alien minds, or supernatural minds of various forms. So I'm taking it as sort of established that humans and at least some animals have minds, and leaving it open as to whether other types of beings have minds. Although, as I will argue, when we analyze the notion of what a mind is in the light of cognitive science, we'll find that I think immaterial minds are not very likely to be possible. Just sort of interestingly, when I was looking for some images to supplement the slides here, you type in Google images of mind, and you get a lot of blue images of like sort of people's heads with weird sciencey things in them. So I guess that's what a mind looks like as far as anyone can say, because obviously like what does a mind look like? But anyway, so I just thought I'd throw that in there. All right, so that's what a mind is. So what about an immaterial mind? Because that's the particular type of mind that I'm sort of going to be focusing on. So an immaterial mind, or perhaps we could use the term soul. Generally, I'll say immaterial mind, but I think that a soul is more or less the same thing here, is a mind without a body, or without any type of material substrate, more specifically. Now, one distinction that I want to make very clearly up front is that what I'm talking about is distinct from the position known as mind-body dualism. So mind-body dualism, particularly substance dualism, says, and I'm putting this very crudely here, but hopefully it will help for our purposes. Mind-body dualism says that the mind is a soul plus a brain, or plus a body. So in other words, that's the notion of dualism, right? That there's two components or aspects. There's the immaterial aspect, and then there's the material aspect. So note that that is not, well, sometimes that might be said to be an immaterial mind in the sense that it's a mind having immaterial aspects or components or a substance, but it's not quite what I'm talking about here, because at least in traditional forms of dualism, understandings of dualism, there is still a material substrate. There is still a physical component, right? That's what makes it dualist. What I'm specifically responding to in this talk or discussing is the idea of a purely immaterial mind. So a mind that doesn't have a body or brain or any type of physical substrate. So again, God would be an example of such a being, or souls, or demons. Or of course, there's these strange ideas like that a demon or spirit can possess a body. I think it's extremely unclear how to make sense of that because the idea is that it's a mind that exists without a body, but then sometimes it can have a body. There's also some religious proponents who argue for out of body experiences, but also near death experiences, where there's supposed to be some idea that you have a soul that like controls your body, but then your soul goes out of your body and can still perceive and think and form memories outside of your body. And so it's sort of, I think, very difficult to make sense of this because that's not actually what a dualist would say. The dualist would say that the soul outside the body is not like mentally cognizant anymore because it needs the body for that. So there's some difficulties around the edges here, which we maybe could talk about in the discussion. But what I'm focused on is the idea that you can have a mind without any physical substrate, so a disembodied mind. Now, there are many arguments that people have given for the existence of some kind of immaterial mind. Most of them are arguments of substance dualism, but there's others as well, like near-death experiences, for example. And instead, what I want to think about is something that's discussed much, much less, although that's in some ways more interesting to me, which is accounts of an immaterial mind. Like, what would an immaterial mind be like? Like, what would it be made of? How would it actually work? It's one thing just to say that there's a mind without a body, but like, what's actually going on there? From my read of the literature, which is, not comprehensive, but based on what I've looked up, there are sort of broadly three different accounts of what an immaterial mind might be. And I just wanted to go through these quickly because I think that it will help preface what we're going to be talking about going forward. So the first is sometimes called an ectoplasm account. And I think that the easiest way to sort of understand what that might be is from a film like Ghostbusters. So, in that film that they have these, what do they call them, like the proton packs or something, where they're kind of like a vacuum cleaner that like sucks up the ghosts and stores them in the backpack. So that's a little weird because it does seem like that whatever this thing is, like it's not supposed to be physical, but it does seem to be some kind of substance. And I think they use the term ectoplasm sometimes in those films. So this is the idea that ectoplasm is some kind of actual like substance that has properties, but is outside the material world. It's not like made of matter or something. It's, I don't know, something else. Now, I don't really know anyone who actually defends this philosophically. Like it's a possibility conceptually, but it doesn't really make any sense because at that point it sounds like you're just saying that there is a mind that's made of something that we just don't know about. Like it just seems like an exotic form of matter that really would still be amenable to like scientific investigation and would just be like a weird material mind, but still material. So that's not really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about an immaterial mind. I don't mean something like from Ghostbusters. The two accounts more that are defended are I'm calling bundle theory here, which does have some other meanings, but I think it'll do for our purposes, or the consciousness account. So the idea of bundle theory, it seems to be something like the mind is just some kind of bundle or mixture or combination of individual component ideas or perceptions or thoughts or something. So again, it's hard to specify a lot here because I don't think there are really well-developed accounts, at least as far as I'm aware. But again, the idea is that you can imagine individual thoughts or perceptions or ideas, and the mind as a whole is just kind of a whole bunch of these things in some way interacting, connected with, or something each other. Now, the alternative account is a consciousness account, which is essentially to say that the mind or a mind is a distinct consciousness. It's like a conscious awareness. And I think that this is the most popular account from dualists or other people who believe in an immaterial mind. So one problem with the consciousness account is that it's sort of quite hard to make sense of a mind that is unconscious, or the various subconscious mental processes that occur in the mind. In fact, most of mental activity from what we know about the mind is unconscious. So it's a little bit hard to, if you say that a mind is just consciousness, then how can you make sense of unconscious mental activity. It kind of doesn't really make sense. Um, so the point here is that I don't really think any of these accounts are very satisfactory, but I'm presenting them here as the best attempts that I know of for people to make sense of this idea of like what is an immaterial mind. Um, and if I'm to be a little bit rude about it, I would say it's not really my fault if it's hard to explain what an immaterial mind is because I'm not the one proposing that such things exist. I'm just trying to make sense of the idea that other people have proposed. Um, but what we'll see is, I think, regardless of the particular conception that we take, bundle theory or consciousness account or something else, you might say, well, it's something we haven't thought of yet, possibly. I don't think we can really make sense of any of these accounts in the light of cognitive science. So that's what I'm going to be leaning towards. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about, I think it's the last thing in this section, is what is a divine immaterial mind? So now we're moving from just the idea of an immaterial mind in general to like specifically what would a God's mind be, or God as a mind. Um, So God is supposed to be an immaterial mind with divine attributes, and usually the most commonly stated of these attributes are omnipotence, omnibenevolence, omniscience, and omnipresence. So omnipotence means all powerful, omnibenevolence all good, omniscience all knowing, and omnipresent being sort of located everywhere or universally present in some sense. Um, Although one might say he sort of transcends the physical realm. Um, Now, some people make a distinction between something called classical theism and theistic personalism. I just sort of mentioned that for people who might have come across these terms before, because there are some differences between theistic conceptions of God. And so it's not like there's one precise conception, but generally these attributes of the omni properties, as I call them, are generally agreed upon, not universally, but this is the traditional conception. Now, there are some other attributes that are less well agreed on. So classical theists, and this is more associated with Catholic theology, but not exclusively. Classical theists tend to also believe that God is impassive, immutable, and eternal. So impassive essentially means that God doesn't have emotions or like responses to anything. And immutable is similar. It means God doesn't change at all. If you add in these properties, it becomes, I think, even harder to understand the notion of God as an immaterial mind, but we'll come back to that. But theistic personalists tend to deny these, and so they'll say, no, God does have emotions, and potentially he can change internally, at least in some respects. And these are just some illustrations of God according to Islam, which has the 99 names of God, which is depicted, some of which are depicted in calligraphy there, and of course the depiction of the Trinity from Christianity. All right, so that's some background about what I am talking about. So hopefully there's some clarity about what I mean by a mind, an immaterial mind, and a divine mind, as best as I can manage in the time here. So now I'm going to, in the rest of the talk, I'll make sort of two different arguments about why I think immaterial minds don't really make much sense, or we can't really understand them, how they would work given cognitive science. So the first will be, I'm calling here an appeal to general theory, and you'll see what I mean by that. So this is more of a general argument. The second argument that I'll make will be a kind of review of different cognitive faculties that have been studied, and look at how those can mesh with the idea of an immaterial mind. So this is more of a general argument relating to something called the computational theory of mind, which some of you may be familiar with. And this is probably the most technical part of the talk, so I'll try to do my best to make this clear, but some parts we maybe can come back to in the questions if people are a little confused. So let me just explain what this view is, the computational theory of mind. It's the dominant view, I would say, in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience, and I think also in philosophy of mind, though there's more debate there, and people define terms slightly differently, so it's a little hard to know precisely, but I think it's still fair to say it's the dominant view in philosophy as well. The computational theory of mind holds that the mind or minds are a computational system, or a slightly more informal way to say that would be the mind is a computer. So that raises the question, well, what is computation? Like, what are you talking about there? Obviously, we don't mean that a mind is literally like your laptop. When we talk about computation, we're talking about something more abstract than a specific device. The most common way to understand this is using a formalism called a Turing machine. So I'm going to try to explain briefly here what a Turing machine is. It doesn't matter if you don't quite get all the details because it's really just the general, well, we'll see later, the general framework that I'm going to be appealing to. Um, but a Turing machine is, it's important to understand it's called a machine, which makes it sound like it's a physical artifact that you can see in a museum. And although people have built Turing machines or approximations thereof, a Turing machine isn't really a physical object. It's really just an idea. Maybe it's a Turing theory of computation is perhaps a better way to describe it, because it's an abstract way to think about what computation is. So the original idea of computation is that it's something that a human does when they sit down and work out logical inferences or arithmetic problems and things like that, right? That's sort of the informal idea. Alan Turing, set out to try to formalize what that process actually is. And he came up with this idea called a Turing machine. He didn't call it a Turing machine, by the way. I think his supervisor came up with that term. Um, so here's the idea. He imagined that you have this infinitely long tape, a ticker tape. We sort of don't really have that anymore, but it's basically just a tape on like rolling wheels so that you can kind of automatically move it backwards and forwards, like an old video cassette tape. And on that tape, you have these discrete sites where you can, or where numbers or other symbols can be placed. Here they're just shown as numbers, but actually it can be any symbol. The machine, in addition to the tape, there's also a scanner, which is shown as kind of a torch here, but it's you can think of it as a camera if you like, or some kind of sensor. Doesn't really matter exactly. The point is it's capable and it's capable of reading the symbols on each segment of the tape and detecting or deducing which symbol is on the tape. So that's all it needs to do. So is it a 0, is it a 1, or whatever other symbol it might be. Now, there's another important component of the Turing machine is what's called a state. That's basically just an abstract representation of what rule the Turing machine should follow at any given time. And corresponding to this state is this rule ledger here, or the instruction table, which is written at the bottom here. Notice that it has current state, and then the symbol, and then the rule. And so what this means is that the machine reads the symbol that's written on the current square, and it reads what state is specified in the memory. So here we're just showing one state, but there could be many states. So we're in state A, and we're reading symbol 1. So actually, annoyingly, this example doesn't show that, but there should be a row corresponding to state A and symbol 1 on this diagram. I didn't make this diagram, by the way, I just pinched it. So we're in state A, we see symbol 1, then we go to the rule column, and then we just do whatever the rule says. And basically, the rules will just be very simple things like move to the left, move to the right, write a certain symbol, and then maybe move in another direction or something like that. So it's extremely simple actions that basically just involve moving the tape and reading or writing symbols. And changing state as well. So you can say like, do these things and then go to state B. So that's about it. So you see, there aren't many different components to this, and it might seem, well, this is way too simple to do anything useful, right? And what is generally thought, you can't actually prove this, but what is generally thought is that anything that a human can work out like logically or mathematically can be computed by a Turing machine or by an appropriately programmed Turing machine. Now, obviously, you have to have the right set of rules and the right set of symbols in order to do that. And so for very complex problems, this isn't a very efficient way of getting things done. But again, that's not really the point. The point is this is an abstract theory of computation. Now, what did I put here? Oh, yeah, I'll just leave that for the moment. So the point is, according to this understanding of computation, when a system is computing, what it's doing is that it's reading symbols and it's processing symbols. It's doing things to them in accordance with set rules. Like, think of them as logical rules. And that's really all it is to do a computation. And if the computational theory of mind is correct, then the mind is a computer. What the mind is ultimately doing, or what makes something a mind, is to be performing computations perhaps in a certain way or in a certain context. So that's the essence of the computational theory of mind. Now, there's something else that I want to mention as well, if that wasn't enough, which is this idea called connectionism. It's sort of, these days, more tends to be called neural networks, that is more or less the same thing. So connectionism is oh, that's confusing. That should say competing approach to computation, a computing approach to computation. That's a little redundant, isn't it? A competing approach to computation. Um, and let me just show you the diagram because that's probably what you might be more familiar with. So this is kind of, it's less a theory of computation and more a different way of trying to implement computations, but the exact relationship is a bit contested. But connectionists or neural networks, they don't have rules and symbols like we saw with the Turing machine, where it's symbols and logical rules and all that stuff. Connectionism doesn't really have that. Instead, what you have is these nodes, which are connected to each other by a weighted edges here. And the idea is that you provide some input to the first layer of the network, and then each node in the input layer will have a certain activation. So you can think of this, for example, the input could be a picture, and the input nodes could all have a value which corresponds to the pixel intensity of that image. And this is in fact how image recognition, a lot of image recognition software works in basis. You put in the image as a series of pixel intensities, and then these nodes then propagate activity to nodes that they're connected to in subsequent layers. And the subsequent nodes in the other layers of the network can detect various features that are present in the initial input. So the way that these visual networks work is that they identify, say, edges, combinations of edges that are used to form features, and then ultimately at the end, it may be capable of identifying, in this case, say, faces, and it outputs an activity of a node, which then can be used to predict, say, oh, this is this person. And the idea is that you train these neural networks by giving them lots of examples, and then they kind of just learn to extract these features themselves. So if they're properly designed and you have enough training data and things like that. Now, I mention this because this is a very different way of thinking about computation compared to the Turing machine approach. But many people see these sort of connectionist networks as a potential way of just implementing a Turing machine. Because as far as you know, in theory, there's nothing that a network like that can do that a Turing machine can't do, and vice versa. It's just that often it's too difficult for us to figure out what set of rules to put in a Turing machine. And so instead we kind of get an architecture like this, which is able to learn by itself. So that's one of the advantages of a system like this. But again, we don't need to worry too much about all these details here. The point is just that there are these different approaches to computation. We can think of it as spreading activation in a network, or we can think of it as like rules that the symbols that are processed through rules. But either way, what we find is that, oh yeah, okay. And so in either of these cases, what we find is that there's certain things that are required in order for a computation to be performed. So in the classical case, like the Turing machine case, we have a set of symbols, we have a set of states that the machine is in. There's some mechanism that records the symbols and reads them, and some rules for recording the symbols and changing between the states. Actual computers like the one that you're using to hear me now don't work like a Turing machine, but they still implement these abstract components just in a bit of a different way. So they use something called the von Neumann architecture, which is how essentially all computers are designed. But you can still describe what they're doing in terms of these abstract components. Now, connectionist computation is different, but it still has a set of things that it requires. So a set of nodes, weighted connections between the nodes, some method for computing the activation on each node, like the amount of activity that it has as a number, and then a rule for updating the weights that connect the nodes together as the network learns. So what I want to emphasize at this point is that, as far as I can tell, all of these things require some kind of physical instantiation. So note that none of these things here say anything about ideas or consciousness. These are really physical, that they're an abstract description of some state that will need to be differentiated with some physical substrate. So remember what the theory was about an immaterial mind. An immaterial mind was one that was either just made up of some bundle of ideas, or it was like consciousness itself, or something like that, right? But our best theory for what a mind is, the computational theory of mind, says that minds perform computations. And whether you think about computations as like in the classical sense or in a connectionist sense, they're all of these either of those approaches to computation require a bunch of stuff that doesn't have anything to do with, like, is not directly anything to do with ideas or consciousness. Now, the idea is, of course, is that consciousness, ideas, thinking, and all that can be built up out of these pieces. But at the bottom level, as we unpack what it is to be a mind, we don't find kind of idea stuff. We find components that will require some kind of physical instantiation that differentiates the symbols or the states, that is a physical mechanism that can record or read the symbols or propagate the weights between nodes and compute activations and things like that. So, this is not a proof. I don't know if someone could come up with a way to implement something like this that had absolutely no physical substrate, but at least it seems to me that there's almost no overlap of what a immaterial mind is supposed to be and what we know about what's needed for computation to occur. And because our best theories of mind indicate that a mind is essentially something that performs computations, maybe in a certain way, then we're going to need some kind of physical substrate to have a mind. Okay, so that's the first, what I call the general theory, the appeal to general theory that I said I would discuss. So then the second one is the second general argument here is the appeal to specific faculties. So this is more empirical, whereas the first argument was maybe a bit more theoretical. So what I want to do in this section is to decompose the idea of a mind. Like, well, a mind has a lot of different things going on. You remember at one of the first slides, I defined a mind as something that does all of these things, like it thinks and perceives and so forth. Well, here I'm going to take some of these different faculties and break them down a little bit further based on how cognitive scientists and neuroscientists who study the mind have what they've learned about the different components or faculties that make up a mind. And we're sort of going to see a little bit about how many of these things do we think could make sense or could be implemented in a immaterial mind. And well, the argument that I'm going to make is probably not very many of them. So let's start with perception. So perception includes really any of the modalities that we have for sensing the external environment, although there's internal perception as well. So vision, audition, and gustation and olfaction would be probably the most well-known ones. Here I have a diagram of that summarizes some components of the visual system in the human brain. And what I want to emphasize here, just taking vision as an example, you can say similar things about other aspects of perception, is that perception is, again, as far as you know anything about perception, it is a physical process that involves transducing physical signals through a series of processing pathways, which occur, as it shows here, at distinct locations in the brain. But it's a series of processing pathways that extracts progressively more abstract and more sort of behaviorally relevant features from the initial sensory data. So we don't need to get too involved in the neuroscience here. These different sections here, like the retina in the eye, LGN, V1, V2, V4, these are just different parts of the brain. And the point here is that as the information is propagated through these different sections, these different locations, different features are extracted. So there's neurons, for example, that are sensitive to different orientations of lines, for instance, and different colors. And progressively over the course of the cortex, more and more abstract features relating to color and depth, and then edge detection and different shapes and other things are extracted. It's not shown in this diagram, but there's even a part of the brain that seems to be largely sensitive to face detection, for instance, because faces are something that humans are evolutionarily very attuned to recognizing. And there's other parts that specialize in object recognition and things like that. Abstracting away from the details, the point here is that in our understanding of the neuroscience, and also similarly in the models, you remember I showed you a comparative example of an artificial neural network, just to bring that up again. This is something that that's interested in neuroscience, is that we sort of trained these things just to try to recognize faces or to perform some function that was useful. And we sort of found that actually it exhibit some of the similar properties to the brain, in that these networks, many of them extract progressively more abstracted features over the course of the over the course of the layers of the network. So it seems pretty clear from really everything we know about perception that perception requires a physical transducer, which connects to whatever it is that is the basis of the signal, like light or sound waves, chemicals on the tongue or the nose, and that then transduces those signals by extracting more and more complex features. So it's entirely unclear to me how you could possibly instantiate this in a purely immaterial mind. And this is what I always find interesting, particularly about near-death experiences, because someone's allegedly, their like soul or whatever has separated from their body, but somehow they can still see and hear. So what exactly is supposed to be transducing the auditory or the visual signals? I really have no idea. I think that that just flat out doesn't make any sense. So let's move on to another aspect of the mind and talk about memory. So memory is not monolithic. So cognitive scientists have discovered there's actually multiple components of memory that are separable from each other. So you can actually lose one component, or one type of memory can not be working well, whilst another still does work well. So in particular, there's a distinction between explicit and implicit memory. So implicit memory involves things like procedural memory. So that's a classic example would be learning to ride a bike. So that's doing things, muscular patterns of muscular activations and things like that. Or things like associative learning. So that includes things like conditioning. So if you're familiar with like Pavlov's dogs, where he rings the bell every time he brings out their dinner and they start salivating, and then if he then just rings the bell without even bringing out the dinner, they'll still start salivating because they've been conditioned to associate the ringing of the bell with the food. That's a type of learning that is implicit, so we don't even need to realize that that's happened in order for that learning to occur. That's distinct from explicit learning, which involves things that you can, it's called declarative, you can like state them, you can declare them propositionally, so facts or things that have happened to you, so like episodic memory. There's also, there's also a lot of interesting work about how memories are structured, or how particularly semantic knowledge is structured. So it's thought that there is complex sort of networks of associations and relations between ideas. So this is just a small component of what such a network might look like. So this here is a knowledge network that describes different components of the activity of like waking up. So waking up involves like subcomponents, like you might yawn, you might check your email, you drink coffee, and it happens before you eat your breakfast. We have a kitchen table, which we use for eating breakfast. Part of that is like the chair. I guess the chair is technically not part of the table, but it's like part of the set. You get the idea. And then there'll be other components as well that you use for that, like, I don't know, your coffee mug and china and whatever else. Kitchen table is located in the house, and then the house itself will have a whole bunch of other associations and relations that it has. So you can imagine that a lot of the knowledge that we have, or in fact, probably all of the semantic knowledge that we have, is connected through a vast network of relations. And so knowledge doesn't just exist in some sort of like isolated atomic unit. It exists in the form of these connections between different ideas and associations, times when these things have happened to us, or emotional valences and things like that. And so the notion of memory is that some kind of recording is made of the oh, I realized I didn't put the distinction between short-term and long-term memories in here as well. I could have mentioned that, but anyway, we'll leave that. So the idea of what memory is essentially is that it's a recording of some fact or aspect of what happens either in the environment or that happens to an organism. And I think essential to this is the idea that there's something that can be the repository of that information, like it's recorded somewhere. Memories are distinct from each other, so there has to be something that distinguishes the memories from each other. And these sort of semantic networks, for example, we can think of these as associations of ideas. And so maybe you can think, well, that kind of fits with the immaterial mind idea. But there's also, I think, an additional component to like what distinguishes the different ideas from each other, and how is a particular event that occurs in the world instantiated as a memory. We have a lot of information from neuroscience about how that works relating to neuroplasticity that I won't get into here. But for this one, I'll say, well, look, maybe you can think of you can imagine a mind that sort of just knows things and there's sort of nothing much more to say about how that happens. But it's sort of much harder, I think, when you actually try to parse out like the different types of memory and how that's supposed to make sense, and how exactly the different memories are encoded or differentiated from each other. Whereas we can easily say a lot about how that works when there's some kind of physical substrate. So here's another faculty here. So inference. So this is making basically deducing one thing from something else that we know. So this includes like logical deduction, analogies, causal learning. So that's making inferences about causation in particular. That's a very important type of inference that people naturally learn to make when they're very young. Abductive inference is about constructing explanations. So like, what's the best explanation for why this happened? Or solving problems. So problem solving is when someone gives you a task or an objective, and then you have to figure out how to do that. Mathematical reasoning is a particular subset of logical deduction, I suppose, but it has its own components. So particularly the idea of like numerosity, so how we represent values of numbers and operations on that. And creativity, well, that's very hard to define, but throw that in there as well. That's something humans can do. We can sort of recombine existing elements in highly novel and sort of unexpected ways. Now, these inferences can be described, and I would argue really the only way we know how to describe them is in mechanistic terms. So here I've just put up a simple circuit diagram for a logical network, which computes the sum of two numbers, or that's part of a network that does this. The important point here is just that we can describe things like mathematical operations just by simple circuits, simple electric circuits that you just apply an electrical voltage to the inputs, and then the output will just always obey. If it's constructed correctly, it will always obey these logical relations. I mean, this is how electronic calculators work. They have these circuits built into them. So we can explicate that using mechanistic processes. If one were to ask, well, what is supposed to be happening when an immaterial mind makes an inference? I think it's just entirely unclear. There needs, in order for inferences to work, there needs to be logical relations or systematic law-like relationships between different steps in the process. Like the whole point of reasoning is that you have stages to it. You think one thing and then that leads you to another thought, and it's not random. There's like a particular logic and ordering to that. Regardless of the type of inference, there's always some kind of rules, even if they're fuzzy rules or rules of thumb. There's some kind of rule that you're applying, some kind of reasoning there. Even when you're talking about analogical reasoning, there's still like patterns of similarity that you identify as being relevant to the comparison, and some similarities that aren't going to be relevant. You need to make a decision about that. So all types of reasoning and inference involve stepwise thinking. I won't explain this diagram, but it's just another example of formal accounts of how reasoning can work. All formal accounts of reasoning involve representations of the state in question, which will always have some kind of physical instantiation that allows them to be represented distinctly, like one number from another, or one explanation from a different explanation. And then there'll be some rules that are applied. Again, they could be deterministic or non-deterministic rules that allow us to make inferences from that. And I think the best you can do to explain how any of this could possibly work without some kind of physical substrate that underpins this and ensures that there's like a logical connection between the different representations and the outputs that you get is just to say, well, it just sort of happens that way. Like that's just how the ideas work, which I don't think is much of an explanation at all. So decision making. So decision making includes things like motivation, which is the relationship between like some kind of internal state and the objects that you desire, so like something that you want. Attention, which relates to your direction of cognitive resources to things that you're focusing on, because we receive many more inputs than we can process consciously at any one time. So attention kind of involves directing our resources to focus on one over another or some subset of those. Reward involves thinking about what the value of different states is, like what do I want to have for lunch? Well, I think about the different things that I could have and how much I would like each of them and what the different outcomes will be. An action selection, or volition, this is also called. So this is essentially deciding between different reward states and then making my decision about which one I want to select. And executive control is relating to attention, but it also incorporates a significant aspect of inhibiting behaviors. So there's like all sorts of impulses that you might have about things that you might want to do. Like if someone makes you angry, or if you're really excited, you might want to shout out, or you might just be bored and want to pay attention to something else. Like all of these sort of random impulses, some of which are conscious, many of which are not, need to be controlled in order to direct your attention and direct your resources towards the thing that actually is going to be useful to you at any given time. And so that's what executive control is for, or conscious deliberative control. Um, so there are, as before, a lot of ways to describe how these different mechanisms can be implemented. So these are just some representation of algorithms that are used for something called reinforcement learning, which is a way we can describe how agents, either artificial or like biological agents, can learn the value of different actions in their environment. And as before, we see a pattern here that all of these formalisms involve different like states. So representations of different states, like these are just different things that could happen essentially. And a representation of the value of that state. And so I need some kind of way to distinguish these different states and represent them internally. And then there's operations that I perform to learn about the outcomes of different states and what would be good or what would be bad for me. This is just an example of an equation like that. But you see it has the structure of a mathematical not an equation, a mathematical expression. And it involves basically learning the value of a state based on your old estimate plus some kind of update based on how good it was when you tried it this time. So a simple way to put it is like you go to a restaurant and you for the first time and you just sort of have a vague idea of how good it might be based on the reviews or whatever. And then you go there once and you find that the food was pretty good. And so then maybe you update your value estimate of that restaurant based on that experience. And you say, well, actually, I think it's pretty good. But then maybe if you go there a second time and it's not quite as good, you'll adjust your value estimate again. And it's probably going to be some kind of average of the two experiences that you have, maybe with some weighting as well to the previous, to the reviews that you read. Maybe those fit into it somewhere. And so the point is that there are a lot of different formalisms that have been developed to describe how this happens. But again, all of them require this kind of structured representation of the state and different outcomes and relationships between like your actions and what different states will be. So it's very similar to the case of memory, where there's a lot of necessary for there is a requirement to have some kind of precise differentiation between different states and some way of encoding, representing the differences in those outcomes, and some specific rules that link how we learn about like rewards or how we choose our actions that is dependent on those states. And so again, it's very unclear how that is supposed to be instantiated without some kind of physical substrate that can encode these differences and maintain law-like relationships between, say, the state that I'm, my evaluation and the experiences that I have of like going to the restaurant and things like that. And language, seeing how we're doing for time. Yeah, just looking to finish up. Language is similar. So this language is actually what I work on. So, you can maybe imagine having an immaterial mind that in some ways is able to comprehend language, although obviously when we're talking about language, that has to be perceived in some way. So we come back to the perception problem, either through speech or reading. So it's sort of unclear how to make sense of that in the absence of a method to transduce that information. But also language is not just it's not a simple question of just understanding something or not. There's a rich sequence of stages that occurs when we make sense of something. So take reading, for example. We have to first identify the letters and then identify what the letters mean in combination to represent a word. And then we have to extract from our what's called the lexicon, so a mental representation of different word meanings. And then we have to fit that into a growing understanding of what the overall sentence is saying. So then syntax becomes incorporated into that, like the rules that connect the different words together and how we put the meaning of the words together in the context of the sentence. And then that's also compositional semantics. It's like composing the elements together. And narrative comprehension involves building a mental picture of many different sentences that are describing something that's happening, like a narrative. And, just like before, there's many formal approaches that we have to understanding how this can work. And all of them require, you can see some of them on the right here. This is actually a figure from one of my papers. I won't describe the details here, but they all require precisely structured representations of, say, words or sentences and rules that allow us to apply that allow us to make sense of sort of arbitrary linguistic inputs like speech or written words, written language, in accordance with a set of rules, be that like explicit rules, like grammatical rules, or rules like fuzzy rules learned through a connectionist network or something like that. So again, all of these will require some kind of instantiation that allows for recording of these rules and distinction between the meanings of different words and things like that. Just like you have a dictionary that defines words in terms of other words, we have some kind of mental lexicon that contains the information that differentiates one word from another. Again, I think it's very hard to make sense of how this could happen without some kind of physical substrate, other than just by saying, well, there's just a whole bunch of ideas that we have somehow, and it just works. So oh, yeah, hang on. I can't remember how many of these I did. Okay, yeah, this is the last one. So affective states. So these are states that have a kind of feeling associated with them. I mean, arguably some of the other ones did, but these are more explicitly associated with that. So like emotion, which is a bit more short term, mood, which is like longer term affective states, pain, reward, so that's like the feelings of pleasure, and conscious thoughts. So many people think that there's an affective component to consciousness. So when I think about something, I like imagine a red apple, there's some kind of redness to that. You could, or perceptions as well. See a red apple, think about a red apple, remember a red apple. There's some kind of conscious affective component to that. This is probably the least well understood aspect of the mind, and many people point to these sorts of states as evidence that there must be an immaterial component of the mind. But again, what I'm focusing on here is actually not whether we think that there's like a material and an immaterial component, so that's dualism, but specifically whether we think that there could be a purely immaterial mind. And what I want to argue is that even for affective states, probably the hardest case, or the thing we know the least about in contemporary cognitive science and neuroscience, I think there's still a lot of indications that it's very hard to make sense of affective states that don't have any physical component. So I've just got a diagram that indicates this in the context of pain here. So when we're talking about pain, like physical pain, pain begins with the activation of certain receptors in the skin or near the skin. So particularly like a type of chemical receptor called nociceptors. And these basically transduce certain types of physical stimuli. So heat or pressure or cold or tissue damage. That sends signals through the spinal cord up through the thalamus, which is a central component of the brain, and then that's processed in a very complicated way, and the pain is actually felt in the brain itself, or it's produced by the brain itself. The current thinking is that that's a sort of representation that's sort of made salient to your attention, because it's like important, hey, pay attention to this. It's a representation of the tissue damage that's occurring there, or that's at least the signals are telling you that there's tissue damage. You can have pain without any tissue damage, like phantom limb syndrome, when people feel pain in a limb that they don't actually have because they're amputees, for example. But that's the signals going wrong and telling their brain that something's there when it isn't. So again, you can just sort of say, oh, well, you could imagine an immaterial mind that just sort of feels pain. But if you imagine taking all of these component pathways and processing out, it's just sort of not clear what the substance of that claim is. It's like, well, everything we know about pain says that it has to fit into this sort of physical processing framework. So it doesn't really make any sense to me to say that they could just somehow exist without any of the signal transduction and processing and attention relevance and other things that we know exist in the case of physical pain. Oh, and there's one last thing that I wanted to talk about, which I think is also important, when particularly in regard to, remember I mentioned that there's two sort of different approaches to thinking about what an immaterial mind might be. So one is kind of like it's sort of a bundle of ideas somehow. And then the other one was like a consciousness theory that an immaterial mind is just like the seat of consciousness, or a seat of consciousness. I think one thing that's hard to make sense of in terms of the consciousness idea is that consciousness is not a binary state. It comes in degrees. There's actually different components to consciousness, just like there are different components to pain. So there's the location of pain. Pain is physically localized often. And there's emotional components to pain. There's cognitive components to pain, like our expectations and what we fear and things like that. There's qualitative aspects to pain, like whether it's a throbbing pain or a stabbing pain. It's similar to consciousness. So consciousness has degrees of awareness. So that's like distinction between deep sleep or light sleep, drowsy consciousness, which you can actually distinguish from fully awake consciousness using EEG, for example. And then there's sort of like the content of consciousness as well, how vivid the consciousness is. So this might differentiate, for example, REM sleep from deep sleep. So you're asleep, you're not awake, but you have a vivid content of that consciousness. Like if you're dreaming, for example, a lot of dreams occur in REM sleep. And there's other different states of consciousness and other combinations as well. But the point is, if we think of consciousness as just the thing that defines an immaterial mind, I think it's kind of hard to make sense of, well, how does consciousness come in degrees and different degrees of vividness and degrees of awakeness if it's just the thing that defines an immaterial consciousness? Like it's not an immaterial mind. It's not like you can say the immaterial mind like comes out of existence or fades away or something. Like it either exists or it doesn't. So I just think this is another indication that that's the wrong way to think about what a mind is. I think we should think of consciousness as a component faculty of a mind that has a sufficient complexity, a type of way to process information and make it generally accessible to our attention, and not as just the thing that defines what a mind is, or at least that's what I argue based on our current understanding. All right, so we're just about at the end here. So I've been talking about different cognitive faculties and what we know about them in light of cognitive science and neuroscience. And I've been highlighting that, for most of these, maybe not all of them, but for most of them, it's kind of hard to make much sense of how this could work if we think of if the mind were to just be purely immaterial, if it didn't have any material substrate. But now let's think about it specifically in the context of God. So of all of these different components or faculties of the mind here, which of them does it make sense for God to have? Or could God potentially have? Now, obviously, it's a bit, one could argue about some of these because, well, I would argue the notion of God is so poorly specified, and different theists will say different things. But here is my attempt at this. So I reckon almost all of these don't make any sense for God to have. So God doesn't have a body, so I don't know how he can perceive anything. God knows everything already. So he can't learn anything, right? That doesn't really make sense if you already know everything. You can't learn. That means you can't reason because you already know everything. It's not like you can find out something new. You already knew that in the first place. There's no steps of reasoning that you have to get to. You already knew that. So reasoning, problem solving, that's all irrelevant for an omnipotent being, an omniscient being. Now, the attention, motivation, things like that, well, it's not like God has limited cognitive resources. He doesn't need to direct his attention to one thing versus another. So I don't think that makes any sense for an omnipotent being. Plausibly, he can make action selection because God is supposed to be able to exercise volition. So I guess we'll leave it that one. And God is supposed to know things. So we'll leave semantic memory in, although I think episodic memory is not really distinct from semantic memory in God's case because he just knows everything. I don't know that there would be distinct types of knowing everything, but maybe there could be, I'm not sure. And I won't go through all of these other ones, except to mention emotion and mood. So whether God can have emotions is one of the things that theists don't agree on, but at least if we go with the classical theism that God is immutable, then he is not changeable, which means that he doesn't have emotions. And plausibly doesn't really have consciousness either, because it seems like consciousness involves some kind of passing through different mental states, or at least the ability to pass through different mental states. So, maybe you could argue about that one, but as far as I can tell, based on what we know about minds and cognitive faculties from cognitive science, almost all of them are not applicable to God, at least as classically conceived. So my take on this is that God can know and will things, and that's about it. So this raises the question, if the vast majority of different things that we think minds can do, based on studying the examples that we have, if the vast majority of them aren't really possible or don't make any sense for an immaterial mind, and particularly an immaterial mind with divine properties, so like the omni properties, does it make sense to call God an immaterial mind? I suggest that it probably does not. So let me just summarize my argument here. So almost everything we know about minds from cognitive science and neuroscience implies that there must be some kind of physical substrate. Notice again, I'm not saying that the evidence from cognitive science proves that there's no immaterial component, but I'm saying that it shows that there's at least a physical component. They can't just be purely immaterial minds or souls. But immaterial souls lack the structure needed to perform computations or to represent different components of the different functions that I talked about. So when we talked about mental faculties, nearly all the mental faculties also require physical instantiation. And in the case of God specifically, the divine attributes rule out, I think, almost all of the cognitive faculties. Now, before we finish, let me just address a few potential counters to what I've been saying. So I've focused on the computational theory of mind as what I call the leading candidate in cognitive science, and I think that that's appropriate. There are some non-computational approaches to cognition, so some rival accounts, but the main ones that I'm aware of would be embodied cognition and a dynamical systems approach. I won't get into too much of what these are here, but at least the first one, embodied cognition, should already indicate that that's not really going to be a rival alternative for an immaterial mind. And dynamical systems theory really relates to, is derived from studying complex, like physical systems, or like biological systems, and the interplay between different variables and their causal interactions with one another. I highly doubt that you can make any sense of that in the context of an immaterial mind. So plausibly, the only real alternatives to a non-computational approaches to cognition are even more physically focused, or will require even more of a clear physical instantiation than computational approaches to mind. So I don't think that that's really going to be a very good objection to the claim that I'm making here, which is that in the light of cognitive science, immaterial minds don't really make any sense. Now, another objection might be, look, you can't compare a divine mind to a mere human mind. Like, obviously, there's going to be a vast gulf of a difference. So everything you've said about minds based on study of human minds is sort of irrelevant, or at least is not very much relevant to understanding a divine mind. So I have two responses to this. One is that at least Christians, and potentially other theists may say similar things, but Christians often talk about the idea that humans are made in the image of God. And as I understand it, that has something to do with the idea of us being, of having minds and being capable of exercising like free will and experiencing and things like that. So I think that that claim is in a lot of tension if you're then going to say that you just can't make any comparison between human minds and divine minds. And a second response is that if we're going to use the same word to describe two different things, there needs to be enough of a parallel to warrant the use of the same word. It doesn't mean it has to be exactly the same. There might be different types of minds, just like animal minds are not the same as human minds, but there has to be enough in common, I would argue. And the argument that I made is that there's almost nothing at all in common between human minds and what could possibly be left over if we remove all the things that don't really make any sense under the idea of an immaterial divine mind. So perhaps what theists should say is that God is some kind of mysterious, all-knowing thing, and sort of leave it at that. And to be fair, some theists kind of do say that, but I think that it leaves us with a very much impoverished idea of what the content of theism even is if we give up the idea that God is supposed to be some kind of mind. And the final objection is that, look, maybe immaterial minds just don't fit in with any of our current theories. That doesn't prove that immaterial minds can't exist. It just means that our theories don't describe them, right? And to which I would say, well, that's all the more reason to reject them if they don't fit with any of our current theories about what minds are or how they work. So I will emphasize that's obviously not a proof. Something could not exist. Something could exist and just we have no way of describing it or no ability for it to be integrated with our current theories. But my opinion is that our beliefs about what exists in the world should be informed by our best scientific theories. And what I've been arguing today is that immaterial minds just really do not fit at all with any of our theories, or almost all of our theories and understandings about how minds work. So yes, it's possible that immaterial minds could still exist anyway, and they just work in a way that we completely don't understand at all and doesn't have any real connection to our understandings of minds. But I just think that if that were the case, there's just no reason to believe in them. So just like Russell's teapot, if something we don't have any evidence for it and it doesn't fit in our theories, that's a strong reason to reject it. And so I'll then, at that point, I'll conclude my formal remarks and happy to take comments and questions.